All right, hey everyone. What I wanted to talk about in this video was how the shadow archetype, which is something that many of you are probably familiar with from Jungian psychology or are interested in, how this archetype is essentially the cause, or at least the psychological cause, of political tribalism, or any tribalism for that matter, and political polarization. And you could probably see how this is relevant to our times, where it does seem that society is divided rather firmly between left and right. Um, but what I do want to make it clear is that this is a historical pattern, and political polarization is nothing new to our times. If one examines history closely enough, you'll begin to see examples where a society becomes divided in two, and they become irreconcilably antagonistic towards each other, and it either leads to a revolution or a civil war. And so, in a very real sense, one can see the influence of the archetypes in history. One can see how the shadow pretty much grips entire societies and leads it along a certain tract, as though it were a distinct entity taking control of mankind. I don't mean that literally, of course. I just mean that as a metaphor. But still, one can once you examine history through the lens of the archetypes, a lot makes sense, and a lot can be fit into very clear patterns that you can observe very easily. But anyways, that's kind of irrelevant. But anyways, what I wanted to talk about, what I should probably start with, is the shadow archetype itself. Now, many of you are familiar with the shadow archetype, but probably think of it more in terms of the personal shadow rather than the archetype itself. And I want to draw a distinction between the archetype as such and the personal shadow. The personal shadow is a part of the personal unconscious. The personal unconscious being things that we've experienced in our past that have influenced our psyche, and so they still exist in the psyche, but they exist beneath our conscious awareness, and so we just aren't aware that of their influence. And there's a part of the personal unconscious which isn't just passively forgotten material, but deliberately repressed. And this happens through the shadow. The shadow is what designates certain elements, certain parts of our psyche, which we repress into the shadow, into the personal shadow. So it's the shadow archetype which is responsible for there being a personal shadow in the first place. And how this happens is that as you develop and as you develop an ego, you associate certain ideas with this ego. So a lot of factors go into building your ego identity. The personality traits that you want to sort of show other people and how you want to present yourself, as well as your beliefs and how you think about the world. And anything that doesn't conform to whatever your expectations are, whatever your beliefs are, becomes repressed into the shadow and is considered not self. And it's that non-self designation, which demarcates between things that you consider to be part of your ego and things which you consider to be not part of your ego, even though they are part of your psyche. Um, and it's that designating factor which is the shadow archetype. So the shadow archetype is not something which is personal. It's something which is shared more or less between all people, and I believe probably all animals. And it has a few functions, and it seems to become more developed as an animal becomes more intelligent. As we can see in primates, it's developed differently than in other animals. But in its most basic form, it's the part of ourselves which is able to look into the environment and designate things as being either familiar or unfamiliar. Particularly that unfamiliar part. It sees it's basically the part of our minds which indicates danger in the external world. And this can be projected. Of course, it's projected upon unknown objects, such as if you see a plant that you're unfamiliar with, there's a good chance it's more dangerous than something you are familiar with. But where this sort of plays into human society is that the archetype designates between us and them. And so it's projected onto individuals and not just objects and not just dangerous animals or predators and stuff like that. And so it demarcates between people who belong to our tribe, my tribe, and therefore, there's some similarity between us, some shared heritage or shared culture, and them, who are different from us, who because they're different, we automatically view them as enemies. And of course, in the primordial past, when we were still very archaic, this kind of way of thinking about the world was very useful, because primates by nature are very antagonistic towards each other, and so it makes sense to view people who aren't a part of your group as enemies. It does make a certain amount of biological sense. It's just that in a civilized society, it makes less and less sense as more people become part of that society. Human groups 200,000 years ago consisted probably at max of 50 people. But today we live in cities of 2 million people. And so there's a very natural human tendency to view things which are unfamiliar and unlike us as potentially dangerous and weird. And this doesn't just apply to a society. I'll give a very general example, where when we become so used to our own culture and our own sort of bubble of our own cultural sphere, we have a very natural knee-jerk reaction to things which are different from what we've expected and what we're used to. And it's usually a negative reaction. For example, I'm pretty sure many of you probably relate to this to some extent. But if you're really into a specific genre of music and you really like it a lot, and it's the sort of genre of music that you identify with your ego, and so you designate, so in a psychological sense, you designate this genre of music as a part of your personality, as a part of your ego personality. And so when you hear a genre of music that isn't the one you associate with yourself, there's oftentimes a very automatic knee-jerk reaction, which is a negative aversion to that music, because it's not what we're familiar with. And so we have a tendency to prefer things which are familiar. If I take this back to society, we, again, draw a distinction between us and them. And it's a very natural distinction. But the sort of idea of the antagonist, of the bad guy, is this this very natural psychological archetype being extended into other domains. And so the shadow archetype is very largely responsible for the fact that they're in our lives, we always feel like we need to have some sort of antagonist that we're fighting against, some sort of bad guy that we're struggling against. This is why pretty much every story has a protagonist and an antagonist. And it's very weird for there to be a story without a bad guy, or with two bad guys, or with two good guys. It feels like there needs to be a good guy and there needs to be a bad guy. And that's psychologically satisfying because the shadow archetype predisposes us to that kind of thinking. And so, things that correspond with archetypes in the mind generally we're more receptive to such things. So that's why we all have the archetypal idea of the bad guy. Like, it's very natural to think of the world in terms of good and bad. But of course, just because it's natural doesn't mean it's necessarily right. Obviously, the world has a lot of ambiguity to it. Good and bad are often relative to each other, and very often good and bad coexist. For example, Jung believed that it coexisted within people, that people aren't composed of good or bad. They're composed of both good and bad. They have good and bad qualities, a dark side, a personal shadow. Jung was very insistent upon that fact. But of course, the shadow archetype itself, when projected outside, doesn't see the world in this ambiguous way. It sees the world as there are good things and there are bad things. And it's this very dualistic way of seeing the world, dividing things into good and bad, which is the bias of the shadow archetype, and arguably its greatest weakness and its greatest danger. Because we apply this to other people very easily, where we humans by nature like to be in groups and like to gather into groups that have some sort of a common belief. And so this shadow demarcation between us and them occurs along various lines. In the far past, it definitely occurred along racial lines, along people who have a shared language, a shared culture, and then it became a shared nation. And then recently, and in many countries today, that sort of tribalism is occurring along political ideologies. And of course, that's not something new. That this has happened many times, where a political ideology divided a society which was otherwise homogenous. For example, ancient Rome everybody had a shared culture, and yet this divide between the I don't know how to pronounce it optimates, something like that, and the what's the other group? What's the one that Julius Caesar was associated with? Optimates. In any case, I can't remember what the two factions were called, but they can roughly be divided. They can be roughly characterized as a reform faction and a conservative faction. but in any case, this sort of ideological division um, causes there to be two camps, and then the one camp will view the other camp in an antagonistic light, and as if they were enemies when really they are not, and really they're just two sides of the same coin in many senses. But of course, the desire to be a part of a group and to have some sort of shared value between you and other people is such a strong desire that it leads to this sort of ideological possession. And one way to strengthen a group and to strengthen the ties between a group is to have a common enemy. And that common enemy is often projected onto the other political ideology. So what you're seeing now is that people are identifying with one side or the other. In let's just take the US as one example, probably because it's the most relevant to most of you or to many of you. But of course, this happens in a lot of different places, and it's very clearly happening everywhere. But if you identify with the liberal ideology, that becomes your camp, and you associate with that group. And then for some reason, you view the other side, the conservative ideology, as your enemy, as your political, as being irreconcilably different from you, and therefore bad. This is a very dangerous way to view the world because, of course, the world can't be simply divided into good and bad. And so when we get into these groups, which we're roughly aligned with, we begin to see the entire world in terms of these two ideologies, which is, in my opinion, super short-sighted because not everything can be thought of as being on a political spectrum. I have big criticisms about the sort of political spectrum divided into left and right because it makes it seem like these are your only two options. You know, some people have the political compass which goes four ways, but even I think that's a bit short-sighted. Really, political ideologies shouldn't exist on a spectrum. They kind of exist in different places in a four-dimensional space. I think that would be the best way to categorize things, but of course, since we view things in terms of a political spectrum, everything becomes divided into two. And that of course that plays directly into the shadow's way of seeing the world and dividing the world into good and bad. You automatically just assume that whatever political ideology you're on and you identify with is the good side, and of course the other guys, they're the bad guys, they're the enemies. And this is a really dehumanizing thing because, of course, just because people disagree with you on your political ideology doesn't make them any less human. And of course, you can't just delegitimize someone else's beliefs because you believe something else. But of course, that's what's happening in today's culture, where we're beginning to view the other side as inhuman, and we begin to judge everyone on that side. So if you're on the right, you begin to view the left in terms of its worst actors. And so if somebody on the left shoots at a police officer, now apparently the entire left is responsible for that. And it's likewise the exact same thing. If somebody on the right does something atrocious, apparently the entire right is to blame for that. Of course, neither of these statements is true. You can't blame an entire ideology or an entire group of people who associate with an ideology for the actions of a few people who are extremists. But of course, both camps view the other camp as being a form of extremism. They again, you don't know, people don't normally accept the evil within themselves. It's very rare when you find a person who is willing to accept the fact that there are parts of themselves which are in a sense evil. Most people just assume that the other side is evil. I'm the good guy and they're the bad guy. That's just the natural way to think. But of course, it's a predisposition of the shadow, which automatically projects outwards rather than looking inwards and rather than looking at the evil within. And so our division into these ideological camps, where we divide ourselves into two tribes, is very dangerous for a number of reasons. Firstly, people become ideologically possessed. And what I mean by this is the fact that they strongly identify with a political ideology. And there could be a number of reasons for that. For example, their parents might have a great influence, or their friends may have had a great influence, or their own psychological predisposition might be towards left or right. As it turns out, many people don't choose their politics based on a reasonable understanding of the facts. What most people do is they just align with whichever side coincides with their psychological genetic predisposition. For instance, liberals tend to be a bit more creative than conservatives, but conservatives tend to be a bit more conscientious. Well, what that indicates to me is that many times when we think we're choosing a political ideology because we think it's the right one, it's actually our own psychology which biases us towards one side or the other. I'm not saying that's the only factor which goes into us choosing a political ideology, because it's obviously not, because people can switch between left and right. But it definitely is a factor. But once we identify with a specific camp, there's a certain sense of Jung called it a group transformation, when a group of people begins to act differently than they would individually. And we form these big political groups, and then we attack the other side and view them as demons, and then we explain why our side is the good side, and if people just listen to our ideology, everything would be good. The problem with this political possession, as I would say, this ideological possession, is that you make the assumption that a single mantra or a single statement or a single idea can be applied equally to every situation, and that will solve everything. You make the assumption that every problem in the world can be solved with a single solution, which is very, very short-sighted, and of course a significant symptom of being politically possessed by your ideology. There's no there's I mean, obviously different situations require different tools and different approaches, and not every single facet of existence can be approached in the same way. And so that's why I stipulate balance between these two camps, but also the fact that we divide things into two. It causes people to see things in terms of left and right, and only in terms of left and right. It becomes inconceivable to imagine things beyond left and right. I've never really totally agreed with either camp, but I also find it very hard to state what my political views are, because they don't seem to exist on this spectrum. They seem to exist beyond it, a completely different direction from what people want. But of course, since the shadow archetype has this natural tendency to divide things into two, people become locked into thinking that there's two solutions. There's two ways, either a liberal approach or a conservative approach. Or if we talk in terms of economics, either a socialistic approach or a capitalistic approach. But of course, we don't live in a fully capitalistic society or a fully socialistic society. There's a clear balance between these two things, which produces the optimal society. But when you're when you're ideologically convinced that a single political ideology fits all solutions, what you're basically saying is you're negating this fact that there needs to be a balance between things. And this sort of extremism is really dangerous and really short-sighted. Now, I don't want to make it seem as if it's our own psychology which is the main problem for this, is the main factor in this problem, especially given the situation in the United States. I believe that the situation in the United States, the shadow is sort of gripping onto the fact that there's a two-party system. Now, of course, the United States isn't literally a two-party system, but through time, it's pretty much become that, where there's two camps and you have to choose one. Well, that's, again, really dangerous, because it plays into that sort of shadow way of thinking, of dividing the world into two and placing yourself on the good side and them on the bad side. And this is kind of sad, because even though people share a lot with, for example, people on the left share a lot with people on the right. They share a common culture or a common language. Many of them look the same. Many of them dress the same. So despite the fact that there's a common culture, people are beginning to view the other side as completely different from me, completely separate from me, and completely on the wrong side. And of course, we're viewing both sides in terms of stereotypes, even though there's a huge amount of there's a lot of people on both sides who are more or less just typical dudes who just agree slightly with more with one side than the other. But of course, we're viewing each side as being extremist and judging them based on their most extreme actors. And so again, this continues in our minds to paint a caricature of the other side as being essentially equivalent to demons. You know, there's something in us that wants to look at other people who are unlike us as though they were demons. You know, the idea of the devil, the idea of demons, which you see in mythology all the time, stems directly from the human mind's predisposition to see other people in that light. Wolf is a man to wolf. I forgot who said that, but some Roman philosopher said that. And I think it's very poignant here and very, very demonstrative of what we're talking about. And so the division into a two-party system, plays directly into the shadow's way of thinking. And of course, it's not just psychology which is at fault here. It's also the fault of a broken political system which has allowed our sort of worst psychological tendencies to come forth. And when we divide ourselves into camps, we tend to just listen to people who exist in our camp. So of course, this is related to echo chambers and the fact that when we choose an ideology, we more or less just get our information from whoever the main speakers are on behalf of that ideology. And the problem with this is that our views of the other side are informed by people who are against that side. So if you're a leftist, or if you're on the left, if you identify as being on the left, most of your information about the right probably comes from people on the left. And so you get this painted caricature of people on the right being demons and being bad people. Political ideologies, once they get into groups, sort of are self-affirming, where people can say very simple things and everyone will agree with it. And so there's a lack of, this is what one of Jung's biggest criticism regarding groups. He thought that the moral standards of a group decrease the more people were in it. And there's a very simple reason for this, is that when you're in a large group, you can't apply the same level of ambiguity and intellectual criticism that you would if you were alone. Because if you're in a group, you want everybody to agree with each other. And the things people agree with each other most are usually very simple statements, such as they're the bad guy and we're the good guy, things like that, which appeal to people very easily, but of course are very simple and not subject to the rigorous criticism which is necessary for a true deep understanding of the nature of things. And of course, one of the things that strengthens groups is the rallying around a common enemy. So your view of the other side becomes continuously tainted, where you just begin to see them as the bad guys, as devils, as people. And of course, this is what leads to conflict. Conflicts are fueled by the fact that one group views the other as evil and terrible and they must be destroyed. And what's interesting about conflicts is that this often causes people to become devils themselves. People think that if they're defeating somebody who's a devil, they're justified by becoming a devil themselves. This is why you see conflicts escalate, where first they begin attacking military targets, and then they begin attacking civilians. And then that's why conflicts become so ugly, because each side thinks they're justified by the what's the adjective for demons? Demonicity. The demonicity of the other side. Each thinks they're justified by the demonic actions of the other side, and they allow themselves to become demons without ever realizing that they were just projecting their own unconscious evil. Now the thing is, when people another problem with becoming politically possessed or ideologically possessed is that you begin to define yourself in terms of a political ideology. Now, this is something I strongly advise against, and Jung probably would have strongly advised against it. You need to differentiate yourself from the herd. It's very tempting to be a part of a group and to be a part of a herd because I guess, of course, there's a very natural tendency. Humans are very social. We like to be with others. We like to be with others who share a common value, a common belief, such as a common religion or a common language or a common culture or a common fandom. This is why you see Star Wars fans, for example, getting into groups and discussing how much they love Star Wars. And so there's something very natural about wanting to be a part of a group, but there's something very dangerous about taking a political ideology and putting it at the forefront of your personal ideology. There are so many people today, especially young people, who take their political ideology and put it at the forefront of their personal identity. Like if you were to ask them, tell me about your personality, they would probably tell you about their politics and what they believe ideologically. But the problem with this is that you so closely identify this part with your ego that anything which goes against this political ideology, which again, you put at the forefront of your personality, anything which is contrary to it. So, for example, if you're a left-winger and there are parts of yourself which have a sort of right-wing attitude towards things, you repress that into your personal shadow. So your personal shadow, the personal shadow of many people who are ideologically possessed, pretty much reflects the other side. This is something I've discovered myself when I've flopped between being possessed by a right-wing ideology and a left-wing ideology, where I realized that there was a part of me which agreed with the other side. So essentially, because people have a desire to be a part of a group, they identify with an ideology. They make this ideology a central feature of their characters, of their egos. So a part of your ego is your political ideology, and then every part of you which sees the world in terms of how the other side sees it, and so is empathetic to the other worldview, that all becomes repressed into your personal shadow and then projected outwards. And this is the key thing. Because our personal shadows are projected outwards, it's this sort of outward projection which causes us to see people who disagree with us as bad guys. And this is a very common thing. When people disagree, they they begin to view each other in an antagonistic way. And of course, that's very natural, but it's all, of course, people have realized that the more mature thing and the more psychologically mature thing is to just accept the fact that there are disagreements. That it's okay for somebody to have different views than you. That you can respect somebody's humanity even if they have a different view than you. Of course, we're beginning to lose that. We're beginning to view our fellow humans as distinct from us and as evil just because of politics. And of course, I don't want to say that politics isn't important. I don't want to say who wins the election isn't important. But I feel like there are other things which are very important. And there's a lot of destructiveness to this sort of political landscape that we live in that can be rectified if we take a proper, a balanced approach, and as well as understanding the psychological roots of this sort of prejudice, of this sort of two-way thinking, which divides the world into camps and then places us on the good camp and everybody else on the bad camp. I think the more enlightened way to view everybody and to view the world and people in the world is to recognize our common humanity, to realize that everybody is a human and everybody deserves to be respected as a human. You shouldn't denigrate people and view them as less than you, almost like they're subhumans, just because they disagree with you on something which is relatively rudimentary. And again, one of the things that I always stipulate is that this left-wing, right-wing divide, most people don't fully identify with one party or the other. Most people's political beliefs aren't represented by either party, but you have to choose one because one of these parties represents them slightly more than the other. When it's kind of crazy. This is the problem with the two-party system. People's views aren't actually getting expressed because they have to pick one of these sides, or otherwise the side which they view as bad will win. And so, of course, the system is broken, and I can't give you a solution to that. I'm just one person, and I talk a lot about psychology. I'm not really a political expert. I understand well the psychology behind this sort of political tribalism, but I don't know. I can't tell you any solutions which are easy. All the solutions I have are pretty outlandish, if I'm being honest. And so we paint the other side based on caricatures which we see. So we see somebody on the right doing something terrible, and then we just associate that with the right. That's now the identity of the right. And of course, we always seek information which confirms our beliefs. People rarely seek information for the purpose of challenging what they already believe. Most people, by nature, want to confirm what they already believe, and that's a very dangerous tendency. And that dangerous self-affirming tendency, again, further contributes to you viewing the other side as monsters that need to be destroyed. And it's insane because people in the U.S., you share a country. You're countrymen. You're supposed to be brothers in a sense, and yet you're viewing each other as evil, as enemies. And why? Why are you enemies? You shouldn't be enemies. You should just be two sides of the same coin. Again, society needs balance between these two opposing ways of viewing the world. But I also think society needs other ways beyond left and right. I think this left and right divide is kind of dumb, and I've never really agreed with it. I've always imagined other ways of being that weren't just the left and right. Consider the possibility that there are ways to view the world that aren't a part of this left-right paradigm. That they're kind of tangential to it. They don't take a liberal view on everything or a conservative view on everything, or in terms of economics, a capitalistic view or a socialistic view. They either find balance between these two or they imagine something completely different altogether. Like there are ways to conceive of existence which don't fall along these two lines, and I really hope that people see that and begin to consider that this left-right divide doesn't really make a lot of sense, and it is kind of dangerous, and it does play into our worst tendencies. So in conclusion, if I wanted to conclude everything that I've said today and I've said in this video, I think that, of course, I'm a student of history, and I read a lot of history. I spend stupid amounts of time on Wikipedia pages looking up obscure wars that happened in China 1,000 years ago. But what I've realized is that somehow we've made it to this point in our psychological and spiritual evolution. And by spiritual evolution, I mean the fact that we're very moral beings. We do have a moral center, and we are capable of genuinely good behavior and genuine love for one another. And so in this stage of our spiritual evolution, we've reached this point where we've identified the psychological cause of our bad behavior. We've pinpointed it that it comes down to this sort of primitive, archaic desire to divide the world into good and bad, and to see an enemy and to attack that enemy and to see them as lower than you, and as unhuman in a sense. We know what causes this. And knowing what causes it gives us power over it. We've become conscious of this bad tendency within us. So we can recognize when it's influencing our thoughts and behavior and sort of step back and realize, okay, this isn't me. This is the shadow archetype that's trying to influence my behavior. And being conscious of it, of course, gives us power over it. We can now do something about it. And we're at this point in our spiritual evolution where we can direct our fates far more than people in the past. People in the past weren't aware of psychology. When people went to war in the past, they did genuinely view the other side as demons. But now we realize that that's just a projection of our shadow archetypes, and that maybe this isn't the best course. Maybe we should learn to respect each other's humanity and to take the views of people who are different from us seriously. That doesn't mean accepting all views that are different from what we believe, but it means to at least listen to the other side, because they probably have a point. You know, people don't just choose these things randomly. There is something which guides their behaviors and their beliefs, and you shouldn't just automatically, denigrate their beliefs just because they're not what you believe. And so we're at this pivotal point where we can do this, where this is possible. If I'm being honest, I don't see it happening between the vast majority of people. For example, the vast majority of people who could benefit from this video probably won't watch it. But of course, if the message I'm saying resonates with you, you can share what I've said and sort of and make people aware of the fact that there's an archetypal predisposition in their minds which traces its roots back to our primate evolution, which is causing us to view the world in this very binary way, which is completely inaccurate, completely inappropriate, and very primitive. We need to be able to accept a certain degree of ambiguity between things. We need to be able to accept that capitalism and socialism can coexist in a society and can be sort of fine-tuned to certain degrees to produce the optimal society. We have to accept that there are ways beyond our political ideologies that we presently have that could exist, that could take us further as a species. We need to speak open to these possibilities, and we need to be conscious of our prejudices, of our natural tendency to view the other side as evil. We need to be, if we're conscious of that, we can do something about it. If we remain unconscious of it, it'll continue to rule our lives. The shadow archetype is a immensely powerful being. The devil doesn't really exist, or one could argue that the devil doesn't really exist, except he kind of does in the soul of man. And it's almost as though the devil every once in a while comes into a society and causes it to be divided, and it causes it to go to war and conflict with each other. And so in a very real sense, the devil is real. He just doesn't exist out there. He exists in here. But knowing that and being aware of that gives us some ability to avoid it. Consciousness is the greatest tool, or one of the greatest tools that we have in our possession to avoid the consequences of our bad nature. This was probably the defining feature of Jungian psychology. If you're conscious of what's inside of you, you have gained some power over it. You haven't gained full power over it, because still the unconscious still influences regardless. But if we know that there's an unconscious mind, which is kind of directing our behavior, we can sort of prevent it from calling all the shots, so to speak. So anyways, that's my spiel on that. Hopefully you've learned something, and hopefully this wasn't too divisive for you. I mean, it really wasn't. That wasn't my intention. My intention was for a unifying message more than a divisive message, especially in these divided times. And I am genuinely concerned about the future, if I'm being honest. I like to be optimistic when I can be, but I also like to be realistic when I know it's appropriate. And being realistic now, I do see this ending up in a negative place, but I do hope that this message resonates with enough people, and that this turmoil that we're experiencing now, due to politics, due to the unnecessary political ideological possession that many people are experiencing, I am hopeful that it will end, it will have a positive outcome. But of course, I'm also cautious, and I'm forewarning people that this could lead to a bad place. But anyways, I don't want to be too negative on this channel. Anyways, thanks for watching. I hope you've learned something. I hope you've considered my message. And if you don't like my message, that's perfectly fine. You're entitled to whatever belief you want, and that's completely okay, and I completely respect that. Okay. Thanks for watching, and take care. Bye-bye.